Roman historians, like Tacitus, wrote that the final battlefield was filled with an unimaginable sound, a barbaric, primitive roar from hundreds of thousands of throats, mixed with the piercing wail of Celtic war horns, the carnix, their bronze, boar-headed bells erupting with a sound that seemed capable of splitting the sky. This was the 61st year of our era, at a place later called Watling Street, somewhere in the expanse of Roman Britain. On one side, hemmed into a narrow valley, stood barely 10,000 men, battle-hardened legionaries of the 14th Legion Gemina and the 20th Valeria Victrix, under the command of Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. They were like a steel spring, compressed to its limit, silent and deadly. Opposite them, flooding the plain to the horizon, seethed a human sea. 100,000, or by some estimates, 230,000 Britons, led by their queen Boudica, a woman with fiery red hair, whose voice, carried by the wind, cut through the noise of her own army. She raced along the lines in her chariot, clutching a spear, her fury almost tangible. Just months before, this fury had burned 3 of the most prosperous Roman cities to the ground, slaughtering up to 70,000 Roman citizens and their allies. Her army seemed an unstoppable natural disaster, a wave of fire meant to wipe the Roman presence from the island forever. And now, this wave was about to crash upon a tiny handful of soldiers. In this moment lies the great paradox of this story, the central question that echoes through the centuries. How could this human avalanche, this unstoppable fiery whirlwind that leveled cities, shatter itself to pieces against so insignificant an obstacle? And, even more incomprehensibly, how could it then simply vanish, evaporating from history, leaving nothing behind but ash and legend? The answer lies not only in the steel of Roman swords, but in the very nature of the force Boudica led, a force whose rage was both its greatest weapon and its fatal curse. To understand the origins of this catastrophe, we must look at the world where it happened. Britain in the mid-1st century AD was not a unified state, but a patchwork quilt of dozens of Celtic tribes, each with its own chief, its own gods, and its own quarrels. It was a land of mists, sacred groves, and ceaseless internal warfare, upon which, just 17 years before these events, in the year 43, the heavy tread of Roman legions had fallen. Emperor Claudius, needing a military triumph to secure his power, began the conquest of the island, and ever since, Rome had been methodically tearing into Celtic lands. The Roman expansion was not just a military conquest, it was a clash of civilizations. Where Celtic settlements had stood, cities with straight streets, forums, and baths grew. Villas with mosaic floors and stone roads appeared, cutting through ancient forests, and most importantly, a Roman administration arrived with its insatiable thirst for taxes and resources. For some Celtic tribes, like the Atrebites, an alliance with Rome was profitable. It gave them an advantage over old enemies. Others, like the Silures in Wales, offered fierce, guerrilla resistance. And a third group, among them the Iceni tribe in eastern England, occupied a precarious middle position. They became so-called client kingdoms, formally independent, but in reality, completely subject to Rome's will, serving as buffer zones on the borders of conquered territories. This system was a ticking time bomb. The Romans looked down on the Britons with poorly concealed contempt, considering them wild barbarians, while Roman moneylenders, such as the philosopher Seneca, ensnared the Celtic nobility in webs of debt, loaning them huge sums at predatory interest rates. The air was thick with humiliation and hidden hatred. The Britons watched as their lands were taken for colonies for Roman veterans, as their youth were conscripted into auxiliary troops, and as foreigners established their own laws and brought their own gods. Britain was not just conquered, it was deeply insulted. And this smoldering fire of widespread discontent was waiting for just one spark to erupt into an all-consuming blaze. The spark that ignited this fire was the last will of one man, Prasutagus, king of the Iceni and husband of Boudica. In the complex political game of his time, Prasutagus was a figure trying to play both sides. He had ruled his people for many years, enjoying the wealth and relative autonomy granted by his status as a friend and ally of the Roman people. He understood that military resistance to Rome was suicide, and so he chose the path of diplomacy and concessions. His strategy was to show Rome absolute loyalty, hoping that after his death, the empire would leave his kingdom and his family in peace. This hope was expressed in his will, a document that was meant to be his greatest diplomatic victory, but instead proved to be his fatal miscalculation. According to Roman law and tradition, when a client king died, his kingdom was usually annexed and turned into a full Roman province. Trying to bypass this law, Prasutagus took an unprecedented step. He named as his co-heirs, on the one hand, his two daughters, and on the other, the Roman emperor himself, who at that time was the infamous Nero. Prasutagus's logic was simple and, as he saw it, brilliant. By making the emperor a co-owner of his kingdom, he was, in effect, buying a guarantee of safety for his family. He believed that Nero, upon receiving his share, would be satisfied and would not touch his daughter's rightful claim to the other half of the inheritance. He assumed that flattery and wealth could satisfy imperial greed, but he tragically underestimated the nature of Roman power. For Rome, such a gesture was not an act of goodwill, but an admission of weakness. The empire did not share power, it consumed it. In the eyes of the Roman administration in Britain, Prasutagus's will was not a reason for compromise, but a convenient pretext for the complete and final liquidation of Iceni autonomy. The king's death became their signal to act. Instead of accepting half, they decided to take everything, trampling the last will of a man who, to the end of his days, had considered himself their ally. In the Celtic world, steeped in mysticism, no significant event occurred without omens and predictions. The fate of entire peoples was woven into a complex web of prophecies interpreted by the Druids, a caste of priests, judges, and keepers of ancient knowledge who were the true ideological backbone of Celtic society. And as Roman authors, particularly Tacitus, testify, Boudica's revolt was preceded by a whole series of sinister omens that filled the hearts of the Britons with both terror and resolve. In the Roman colony of Camulodunum, the main bastion of imperial power, the statue of the goddess Victoria suddenly fell from its pedestal, landing face down, as if fleeing an unseen enemy. Inhuman cries and howls in a foreign tongue were heard in the Senate House, and groans echoed in the theater, as if the city were full of ghosts. A mirage of a ruined city was seen in the Thames estuary, and the river's waters themselves turned blood red. These signs, which the Romans dismissed as barbarian superstitions, were a direct message from the gods to the Celts. The time of reckoning was near. An especially important backdrop to these events was the military campaign being waged at that very moment by the Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, on the island of Anglesey, or Mona, off the coast of Wales. Anglesey was not just an island, it was the citadel of Druidism, a kind of Celtic Vatican, a sacred place of groves dedicated to their dark and cruel gods. Suetonius, a pragmatic and ruthless commander, understood that as long as the Druids were alive, the true subjugation of Britain was impossible. They were the ideological architects of all resistance. He therefore launched a full-scale invasion of the island to cut out this nest of vipers at its root. Tacitus vividly describes how the Roman legionaries, upon landing, froze for a moment in horror at the sight before them. On the shore, they were met not only by warriors, but by crowds of women in black mourning clothes with disheveled hair, carrying burning torches, and among them, druids, raising their hands to the sky and screaming terrible curses. This operation to destroy the spiritual heart of Britain became the final straw. While Suetonius was cutting down sacred groves and defiling altars in the west, in the east, the prophecies were beginning to come true, and the humiliation of one woman was about to turn into a bloody harvest for the entire province. Who was this woman whose name became synonymous with fury and vengeance? History, written by her enemies, has left us only sparse and biased sketches. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing more than a century after the events, paints an almost mythical image of her. A tall, imposing woman with a harsh gaze, thick, fiery red hair falling below her waist, and a sharp, piercing voice. She wore a massive golden necklace, a torque, a symbol of nobility, a colorful tunic, and a thick cloak fastened with a brooch. She always carried a spear. But behind this vivid portrait hides a real figure, whose personality we can reconstruct based on her social status and culture. Boudica, whose name in the Celtic language likely meant victory, was a member of the highest aristocracy. In Celtic society, women, especially those of noble birth, possessed far greater rights and influence than in the Greco-Roman world. They could own property, participate in political life, and even lead troops into battle, a concept that was utterly savage and perverse to the Romans. She was undoubtedly raised not as a fragile homemaker, but as a future ruler. She was taught not only household management, but also rhetoric, diplomacy, and perhaps even the art of war. She was priestess, mother, and warrior all in one. Her marriage to Prasutagus was most likely a dynastic alliance, strengthening the power of two noble houses. She was not just the king's wife, but his co-ruler, whose word carried weight in the council of elders. Her connection to the people and the land was not abstract, but deeply personal and sacred. In Celtic mythology, the land was a goddess, and the queen was her earthly embodiment. To insult the queen was to defile the land itself. Therefore, when the Romans came after her husband's death, not with offers of cooperation, but with swords and whips, they made a mistake they simply could not comprehend within their worldview. They thought they were merely humiliating a woman, the widow of a conquered king. They did not understand that they were striking at the very heart of the faith, honor, and identity of an entire people, awakening a power far more ancient and terrible than any legion. The turning point, which transformed smoldering discontent into open rebellion, was an act not just of political greed, but of sadistic, demonstrative humiliation. After Prasutagus' death, the province's procurator, Catus Decianus, arrived to claim the inheritance in the emperor's name. This man was apparently a typical example of the corrupt Roman bureaucracy, for whom a distant province was merely a place for quick enrichment. He had no intention of honoring any wills or local customs. The kingdom of the Iceni was declared the property of Rome. Roman centurions and tax collectors swarmed the Iceni lands like locusts, cataloging and confiscating the property not only of the royal family, but of the entire local nobility. Their homes were looted, and they themselves were enslaved, with the declaration that the land, and everyone on it, now belonged to the empire. When Boudica, as the lawful ruler and heir, tried to protest this lawlessness, appealing to her husband's last will, the Roman reaction was swift and monstrous. They decided to teach the barbarian queen and her entire tribe a lesson in absolute submission. She, an aristocrat, a descendant of kings, was tied to a post in front of her subjects and publicly flogged like a common slave. But the Romans did not stop there. To destroy not only her honor, but the very future of her dynasty, her young daughters were raped before her eyes. This act of unimaginable cruelty was a calculated political statement. In the patriarchal Roman world, rape was a way to demonstrate total dominance, the final destruction of an enemy's honor. They didn't just want the land and gold. They wanted to erase the very idea that the Iceni could have a future, their own royal bloodline, their own leaders. But this is precisely where Roman logic failed. Instead of breaking the will to resist, they ignited it to its peak. The humiliation of Boudica and her daughters became a personal insult to every Iceni, to every Briton who heard of it. This was not merely a crime, it was a sacrilege, one that demanded not justice, but bloody atonement. The Roman boot had stepped on a viper, and it was ready to strike back with deadly force. From the ashes of this monstrous humiliation, a rebel was not just born, but a fury, a living embodiment of the Celtic goddess of war and vengeance, who, by some accounts, was named Andrasta. Boudica's psychological transformation was absolute. From a ruler who, like her husband, might have still hoped for some compromise with Rome, she became an angel of vengeance, for whom no concepts existed anymore, except us and them, life and death. Her personal pain, the pain of a beaten woman and a mother whose children were defiled, merged with the collective pain of her people, humiliated and robbed. This synergy of the personal and the public became the fuel that fed the flames of the most terrible rebellion in the history of Roman Britain. Boudica became the voice of this pain. Her speeches, which have come down to us through Roman historians, may be embellished, but they accurately convey the essence of her message. She appealed not to political freedoms or economic benefits. She appealed to primal instincts, to honor, to vengeance for defiled women, to the protection of children from slavery, to the expulsion of outsiders who brought nothing but taxes, debauchery, and arrogance. She turned the rebellion into a sacred war. As the chronicles attest, before the decisive battle, she performed a ritual of divination, releasing a hair from the folds of her dress and interpreting the direction of its run as a good omen from the goddess Andrasta. To her warriors, she was no longer just a queen, but a prophetess, a priestess, leading them into a final cleansing battle. Her goal was not simply to expel the Romans, but to destroy, to wipe from the face of the earth everything associated with them, their cities, their temples, their laws, their language, and even themselves. In this war, there were to be no prisoners, no mercy, only total extermination. The internal demon, born in her by Roman whips, demanded blood, and all of Eastern Britain was ready to provide it in abundance. She became a symbol of absolute, uncompromising resistance, a force that blinds, leading simultaneously to the greatest victories and to inevitable ruin. Boudica's cry was heard far beyond the lands of the Iceni. The first to answer her call to arms were their southern neighbors, the powerful Trinovantes tribe, and they had their own, very compelling reasons. It was on their ancestral lands that the Romans had founded their first veteran colony and the de facto capital of the province, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. This city became a symbol of their own humiliation for the Trinovantes. Their best fields had been seized and distributed to Roman legionaries, while they themselves were forced to work on building the city that stood as a monument to their enslavement. The crown of this humiliation was the construction in Camulodunum of a giant temple dedicated to the divine Claudius, the very emperor who had begun the conquest of Britain. The Trinovantes were forced to pay taxes for the upkeep of this temple and to worship the man who had taken their freedom. For them, This was an unbearable sacrilege. Therefore, when news reached them of the Iceni uprising and the defiled queen, their anger, which had been building for years, found its release. The alliance of the Iceni and Trinovantes instantly created a critical mass capable of challenging Roman rule. Discontented people from other tribes began to flock to them, all those who had suffered from Roman greed and cruelty. Boudica's army grew by the day, transforming from a band of avengers into a vast, though poorly organized, horde. This was not a professional army in the Roman sense, but a people in motion. Warriors marched with their families, their wagons, their livestock, and all their belongings, convinced that they were not just going to war, but to drive out the invaders forever and take their place. This confidence was bolstered by one crucial fact. The main striking force of the Roman army in Britain, the majority of the legions under the command of the governor Suetonius Paulinus himself, was at that moment on the opposite end of the island. The province was virtually defenseless, and Boudica knew it. Her first strike had to be at the very heart of Roman power, at the city that was built on the tears and bones of her new allies. The first target of the United Britain Army was Camulodunum. The choice was not random, it was deeply symbolic. This was not just a city, it was the showcase of Roman civilization, a bastion of imperial power and ideology. Founded as a colony for discharged veterans, it was designed as a little Rome in the heart of barbarian lands, with a forum, a theater, and of course, the magnificent temple to the deified Emperor Claudius. The city had no strong defensive walls. The Romans, in their arrogance, believed their very presence was sufficient protection from the savages. This proved to be a fatal mistake. When the 100,000-strong avalanche of Britons fell upon Camulodunum, the city was doomed. The small garrison and the inhabitants, mostly elderly veterans and their families, were caught completely by surprise. A massacre began. The Britons, intoxicated by years of suppressed hatred, spared no one. Not men, not women, not children. They were taking revenge not just on soldiers, but on a symbol. Houses were set on fire, one after another, and soon the entire city was a blazing hell. The last bastion of resistance was the Temple of Claudius itself. A few hundred survivors barricaded themselves within its massive walls, hoping to hold out until help arrived. They lasted 2 days. But no help came. The Britons stormed the temple and slaughtered every last person inside. Then they razed it to the ground. The fall of Camulodunum was not just a military victory, it was an earthquake that shook the foundations of Roman rule in Britain. A city considered impregnable had been destroyed. A temple dedicated to a god-emperor had been desecrated. It was an act of total sacrilege that showed all wavering tribes that Rome wasn't all powerful, that it could be and should be beaten. News of the burned capital spread throughout the province, sowing panic among Roman citizens and inspiring more and more Britons to rebel. Boudica's fiery whirlwind was only just beginning to gather its destructive force. The news of Camulodunum's fall caught the nearest major Roman unit by surprise, the 9th Spanish Legion, stationed at Lindum, modern-day Lincoln. Its legate, Quintus Petilius Cerialis, was a relative of the future Emperor Vespasian, and an ambitious, though, as it turned out, overly self-confident commander. Realizing the scale of the disaster, he did what his military duty required. He immediately marched his legion south to crush the rebellion and relieve the besieged city. However, he had at his disposal not the full strength of the legion, but only its infantry, numbering about 2,000 men. The cavalry, for some reason, had been left behind or was engaged elsewhere. Cerialis clearly underestimated both the numbers and the fury of the rebels. He marched forward, confident that the mere rumor of the Roman eagle's approach would cause the barbarian mob to scatter, But he was not facing a mob. He was facing an army that had already tasted blood and victory. Boudica, receiving intelligence on the 9th Legion's movement, set a perfect ambush. Using their superior knowledge of the terrain, the Britons allowed the Roman column to advance into a wooded area and then attacked simultaneously from all sides. For the Romans, who had no time to form ranks, it was a catastrophe. Their famous discipline and tactics were useless against the chaotic, all-encompassing onslaught of tens of thousands of warriors emerging from behind every tree. The battle turned into a slaughter. The legionaries were surrounded and almost completely wiped out. The entire infantry of the 9th Legion perished in that forest. Only the legate, Petilius Cerialis, and a small detachment of his cavalry managed to break through the encirclement and flee back to their fortified camp. This victory had enormous psychological significance. If the fall of Camulodunum was the destruction of a civilian symbol, the rout of the 9th Legion was a slap in the face to the Roman military machine itself. For the first time in the entire conquest of Britain, a legion had been practically erased from existence. The morale of the rebels soared. It now seemed there was no force that could stop them. And the procurator Catius Decianus, the very man whose greed and cruelty had started it all, realizing what a storm he had unleashed, disgracefully fled to the continent, abandoning the province to its fate. While the fire of rebellion raged in eastern Britain, the chief architect of Roman power in the province, Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was hundreds of miles away on the island of Anglesey, completing his campaign to eradicate the Druids. Suetonius was the complete opposite of the reckless Cerialis and the cowardly Decianus. He was one of the finest generals of his time, experienced, cool-headed, decisive, and utterly ruthless. He had learned the harsh realities of war in the mountains of Mauritania in North Africa, and was known for his iron discipline and tactical genius. When the staggering news of the burned Camulodunum and the annihilated 9th Legion finally reached him, he instantly grasped the mortal danger of the situation. He understood this was not a local riot, but a war for survival, with the fate of the entire province at stake. Without losing a day, he left a small garrison on Anglesey and, by forced march, moved his best forces, the 14th Legion and part of the 20th, eastward, straight into the heart of the rebellion. His path lay through hostile territory, where every forest could hide an ambush. He moved at the limits of human endurance, covering some 260 miles in a matter of days. His goal was Londinium, modern-day London, the largest commercial and financial center of Roman Britain. Suetonius hoped to arrive before Boudica and organize a defense. However, upon reaching the city, he soberly assessed the situation. Londinium, like Camulodunum, had no serious fortifications. His own forces were too small to both defend the city and fight Boudica's massive army in open terrain. And so, Suetonius Paulinus made one of the most difficult and cruel decisions of his career, a decision that doomed thousands of lives, but ultimately saved the province. Arriving in Londinium and seeing the desperation of its inhabitants, who were pleading for protection, Suetonius Paulinus faced a classic military dilemma: save the city or save the army. He understood that his 10,000-man detachment was all that stood between Boudica and the total collapse of Roman rule in Britain. If he stayed in Londinium and accepted battle under unfavorable conditions, his army would most likely be annihilated, just as the 9th Legion had been. And without an army, the province was doomed. Therefore, ignoring the pleas and tears of the citizens, he gave an order that sounded like a death sentence. The army was abandoning the city. He sacrificed the province's largest economic hub to preserve his only effective fighting force. He offered those residents of Londinium who could travel, men, women with children, the chance to leave with his army. But it was clear that a huge caravan of refugees would only slow him down and make him vulnerable. Most stayed behind, hoping for a miracle or lacking the strength to flee. This decision demonstrates the fundamental difference between the Roman and barbarian approaches to war. Boudica was driven by emotion, fury, revenge. Her goal was the destruction of symbols. Suetonius, however, was guided by cold, strategic logic. To him, cities, money, even the lives of thousands of citizens were just resources on the chessboard of war. The most important piece on that board was his army. As long as the legion was alive, the province was alive. It was a ruthless, but from a military standpoint, the only correct calculation. Leaving Londinium to its fate, Suetonius continued his tactical withdrawal, luring Boudica's army further and further from its homelands, buying time and searching for the perfect place to fight the decisive battle, a battle he would fight on his own terms. And behind him, the glow of flames that were already engulfing the doomed city was visible. Londinium in the mid-1st century was not the administrative, but the commercial heart of Britain. Located at a convenient spot on the River Thames, it was a prosperous, cosmopolitan port filled with merchants, traders, moneylenders, and artisans from all corners of the empire. When Boudica's army, enraged by Suetonius's withdrawal, burst into the defenseless city, it found the perfect target for its hatred. Here were the very people the Britons blamed for their enslavement, Roman citizens and their collaborators, growing rich off the wealth of their land. What followed was not a battle. It was a methodical and total slaughter. Archaeological excavations in modern London have uncovered a thick, distinct darbo and black layer beneath the city streets, the so-called Boudica layer. It is a stratum of burned clay, charcoal, and ash, up to half a meter thick, all that remains of the prosperous Roman city. It is the silent witness to the fiery vortex that swept through here nearly 2,000 years ago. The Britons took no prisoners and had no interest in slaves. Tacitus describes horrific scenes of torture and ritual executions. People were not simply killed. They were hanged, crucified, burned alive. They were especially cruel to the high-born Roman women. Their breasts were cut off and sewn to their mouths, after which they were impaled on sharp stakes. These atrocities were apparently part of a ritual sacrifice to the goddess Andrasta. The city was plundered and burned to the ground. Boudica stood at the peak of her power. She had destroyed the 3 main Roman centers in Britain, crushed a legion, and forced the governor himself to flee. At that moment, her victory seemed inevitable. But it was in this very triumph, in this revelry of destruction, that the seeds of the coming catastrophe were already hidden. Her army, gorging on vengeance, was losing precious time and thought nothing of the future, while her enemy, Suetonius Paulinus, coolly prepared his counterstroke. It was at this very moment, at the height of Boudica's success, that the first cracks began to show in her seemingly invincible force. These cracks were inherent in the very nature of her army and lead directly to the answer to the main question. Why did this force suddenly disappear? Boudica's army was not a professional force like the Roman legions. It was, in essence, a giant tribal levy, held together not by discipline or strategy, but by a shared hatred and a thirst for vengeance. It had no centralized command system. The chiefs of the allied tribes likely followed Boudica only as long as her success served their own interests. But its most fatal weakness was its logistics, or rather, the complete lack of them. The Roman army was a marvel of organization. It had engineers, medics, quartermasters, and a supply system that allowed legions to operate autonomously in enemy territory. Boudica's army was its polar opposite. As mentioned, the warriors had brought their families with them, wives, children, the elderly. Trailing the army was a gigantic baggage train of thousands of wagons, carrying not just provisions and loot, but all their household possessions. These wagons and crowds of non-combatants turned the army into a slow, unwieldy organism. They consumed vast amounts of food and water, making the army completely dependent on plunder. As long as there were cities to burn and loot, this was not a critical problem. But what would happen when there was nothing left to plunder? This horde could not stay in one place for long. It was like a swarm of locusts that devastates the fields and must move on in search of new food. Suetonius, an experienced general, understood this perfectly. By retreating, he was not just saving his army, he was luring Boudica into a trap, stretching her makeshift supply lines and allowing hunger to become her invisible but most terrifying enemy. After the destruction of Londinium, Boudica's firestorm rolled on and crashed into the third and final major town in its path, Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans. Verulamium was different from Camulodunum and Londinium. It was not a Roman, but a British town, the capital of the Catu-Valauni tribe, who had, however, adopted the Roman way of life and received the status of a municipium, granting its residents certain rights. To Boudica and her allies, especially the Trinovantes, old enemies of the Catu-Valauni, the people of Verulamium were collaborators, traitors who had sold out to Rome. Therefore, the town's fate was sealed. It met the same end as the previous two. It was plundered, burned to the ground, and its population slaughtered. From a military perspective, the destruction of Verulamium was another loud but strategically meaningless act. Instead of pursuing Suetonius's army and trying to destroy it while it was outnumbered, Boudica spent precious days on another symbolic annihilation. She was acting as an executioner, not a general. Each burned city intoxicated her army with a sense of omnipotence, but in reality, it only worsened her strategic problems. First, it gave Suetonius the one thing he didn't have: time. Time to gather his scattered forces, wait for reinforcements from other legions, though the second legion, stationed in the south, never came to his aid. Its commander simply lost his nerve, and most importantly, chose the perfect battlefield. Second, with each new act of genocide, the fury of the Roman soldiers grew. They heard the stories of atrocities committed in the captured cities, and their hearts filled with a thirst for vengeance. Boudica, without realizing it, was turning her enemies from mere soldiers into avengers who would fight to the last drop of blood. Thus, while reveling in tactical victories, she was completely losing the strategic war, allowing her cunning and cold-blooded opponent to slowly but surely tighten the noose around her neck. While Boudica's army indulged in plunder and killing, it began to be stalked by another, far more insidious enemy: hunger. The rebellion had begun in the spring, at the height of the planting season. The Iceni and Trinovantes, abandoning their fields, had gone to war. They were so confident of a quick and total victory that they neglected the very basis of their existence: agriculture. They expected to feed themselves from captured Roman supplies. And at first, this worked. The storehouses and granaries of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were full of grain and provisions. But the enormous 100,000-strong horde, burdened with tens of thousands of civilians, consumed these supplies at an incredible rate. And after the cities were burned and the countryside around them ravaged, the food source dried up. The Briton army turned into a giant, starving organism, forced to keep moving in search of food. This put Boudica in an extremely vulnerable position. She could no longer choose where or when to fight. Now, her route was dictated by hunger. She was forced to pursue Suetonius's army, because only by crushing it could she gain access to the Roman supply depots and bases in the west. The Roman supply system, based on a network of fortified forts, warehouses, and roads, was one of the main pillars of their power. It allowed their army to operate effectively in any season and any terrain. Boudica had nothing like it. Her strength was monolithic, but fragile. Rome's strength was systemic and resilient. This contrast between the chaos of the rebels and the order of the empire became more and more apparent. Suetonius, as he retreated, likely employed scorched earth tactics, destroying all supplies behind him, further worsening the Britons' food crisis. Time was on the Roman side. Every day of delay made Boudica's army weaker, hungrier, and more desperate, pushing it toward the only possible outcome, a decisive battle on terms dictated by her enemy. Finally, Suetonius Paulinus decided that the time for retreating was over. He had worn down the enemy sufficiently, gathered all his available forces, about 10,000 men, including remnants of the 9th Legion, and, most importantly, found the ideal field for the coming battle. The location he chose, its exact site is still debated by historians, but it's traditionally associated with the road Watling Street, was a tactical masterpiece. It was a narrow valley or gorge, protected from behind by a dense forest, which eliminated any possibility of a flanking maneuver or an attack from the rear. The valley's sides were framed by steep wooded slopes, which prevented the Britons from using their overwhelming numbers to surround the Roman lines. In this way, Suetonius forced the enemy to attack him head-on, at the narrowest point, where Boudica's massive army could not deploy and would be forced to engage in small, fragmented waves. In essence, he turned the battle from a clash of armies into a series of localized skirmishes, where the discipline and training of his legionaries would be decisive. He had completely neutralized Boudica's main advantage, her numbers. The Roman army formed a dense, impenetrable line. In the center, the heavy infantry of the legions. On the flanks, the auxiliary troops and cavalry. They stood in silence, conserving their strength and nerve, ready for the fight they had so long awaited. Boudica, whose army was suffering from hunger and exhausted from the chase, had no choice but to accept battle on these, her enemy's terms. She approached the battlefield, confident of her victory, not realizing that her opponent had already set a fatal trap from which there was no escape. Before the battle, as was custom in the ancient world, both commanders addressed their troops with speeches to inspire them to heroism. And although the texts of these speeches, passed down to us by Tacitus, are more likely literary reconstructions, they brilliantly capture the clash of two worlds, two ideologies. Boudica, riding in her chariot with her daughters, spoke not as a strategist, but as a prophetess and an avenger. She reminded her warriors of the humiliations they had endured from the Romans, the taxes, the slavery, the defiled honor. She said that she, a woman of noble birth, was fighting not for power or wealth, but for vengeance and freedom, and that in this battle they must conquer or die. "This is my resolve, a woman's resolve," she declared. "As for you men, you can live and be slaves." Her speech was passionate, emotional, full of righteous fury. She appealed to the hearts and feelings of her warriors, and they answered her with a deafening roar. Suetonius Paulinus, in contrast, addressed his legionaries with a short, pragmatic, and grim speech. He urged them to ignore the wild cries and the sheer number of the barbarians. He reminded them that in that crowd, there were more women than warriors, and that those warriors were poorly armed and untrained. He ordered them to stand in a dense formation, first to hurl their javelins, the pila, and then, protected by their shields, to cut the enemy down with their swords, the gladius. He told them to think only of victory and not to be distracted by plunder, promising that all the spoils would be theirs after the battle. His speech was aimed not at the heart, but at the mind and at their professional pride. It was an instruction, not a sermon. In these two speeches, the entire essence of the coming clash was reflected. On one side, elemental passion, fury, and faith in divine justice. On the other, cold calculation, iron discipline, and perfected tactics. The outcome of the battle would show which was stronger, the fire of emotion or the steel of a system. One of the key factors that predetermined the battle's outcome was a tactical paradox the Britons created for themselves. Confident in their inevitable victory, they had brought with them not only their families, but also their entire gigantic baggage train of thousands of wagons. They arranged these wagons not in a rear camp, as would be militarily sensible, but in a crescent, directly behind their own advancing troops. The wives and children of the Briton warriors were to be spectators of their triumph, witnesses to their husbands and fathers finally crushing the hated Romans. This overconfidence, this turning of the battlefield into a kind of theater, became their fatal mistake. The massive baggage train, which was meant to be a symbol of their victory, instead became a wall, cutting off all paths of retreat for their own troops. They had trapped themselves. Suetonius, undoubtedly, saw this maneuver and understood the immense advantage it gave him. Now he didn't need to worry about being outflanked or pursuing a retreating enemy. He needed only to withstand the first charge and then begin to push forward, knowing that the enemy would have nowhere to run. The Britons had thus turned their greatest strength, their numbers, into their greatest weakness. Their huge army, deprived of room to maneuver and trapped from behind by its own wagons, was transformed from a fearsome attacking force into a giant, doomed mob. The psychology of this decision is astounding. It was a gesture of absolute hubris, a challenge to fate. They were so blinded by their previous successes that they completely lost touch with reality and with the tactical genius of their opponent. And fate would punish them cruelly for this arrogance, turning the spectators of their triumph into the victims of their own defeat. The battle began with a deafening roar and a chaotic, unstoppable charge by the Britons. Tens of thousands of warriors, brandishing long swords and spears, rushed with wild cries at the thin line of Roman legionaries. It was a human avalanche that should have swept everything from its path. But it crashed against an iron wall of shields. Suetonius had ordered his men to stand motionless, ignoring the screams and insults. The legionaries locked their large rectangular shields, the scutum, creating a nearly unbreakable wall. They absorbed the first, most powerful impact, allowing the Britons' fury to break against their discipline. Then, on the centurion's command, the first rank of legionaries simultaneously hurled their heavy javelins, the pila. Thousands of pila, with their special soft metal shanks designed to bend on impact, slammed into the shields and bodies of the attackers. A Briton warrior whose wooden shield was struck by a pilum was faced with a choice: either drop the now heavy, useless shield and be left defenseless, or try to fight while dragging the cumbersome spear. This first phase of combat sowed confusion and chaos in the attacking ranks. Their initial momentum was broken. And then, the Roman war machine shifted to its second phase. The legionaries, still protected by their shields, drew their short, broad swords, the gladius, designed not for slashing, but for stabbing in close quarters. They operated not as individual warriors, but as a single, deadly mechanism, a meat grinder. Each legionary occupied a small space, protected by his neighbor's shield, and delivered quick, precise thrusts from behind this wall. The Britons, with their long swords, needed space to swing, but in the horrific crush that had formed against the Roman line, they could not use their weapons effectively. A methodical, cold-blooded slaughter began. When the first, most furious charge of the Britons had faltered, Suetonius Paulinus gave the order his legionaries were waiting for: counterattack. The Roman infantry, which had stood as a monolithic wall, now moved. They shifted into their famous pig's head wedge formation, the caput porcenum. Several maniples, or units, formed a triangle that drove like a battering ram into the unruly mass of Briton warriors. The effect was devastating. This steel wedge, protected on all sides by shields, punched holes in the enemy's ranks, splitting their vast army into smaller, isolated groups. The Britons, lacking unified command and tactical cohesion, could do nothing to stop this organized pressure. Their numerical advantage turned against them. In the ensuing crush, they got in each other's way, unable to turn, becoming easy prey for the short gladius of the legionaries. From the flanks, the Roman cavalry charged, enveloping the already disorganized mob, completing the encirclement, and cutting off the last paths of escape. The battle, which had begun as a furious assault, turned into a one-sided massacre. The Romans were not just fighting, they were working, methodically, without emotion, advancing step by step, leaving mountains of bodies behind them. Boudica, watching from her chariot, must have seen in horror as her invincible army, her pride, transformed before her very eyes into a panicking, doomed mob. The moment was lost. The battle was lost. But the worst was yet to come. When the first ranks of the Britons, unable to withstand the pressure of the Roman wedges, broke and tried to retreat, they ran into the nightmare they had prepared for themselves. Their path to the rear was blocked by their own baggage train. Thousands of wagons, where their wives and children sat, waiting to watch their triumph. The impassable wall of carts, livestock, and people, which was meant to be a spectator stand, had turned into a death trap. Panic erupted. Warriors, fleeing the Roman swords, desperately tried to push through the logjam of wagons, trampling their own women and children. The retreat turned into a monstrous, chaotic stampede. The screams of the wounded mingled with the wails of women and the cries of children. In that moment, Boudica's army ceased to exist as a fighting force. It became a giant, agonized mass of people, caught between the advancing legions in front and the impassable barrier of wagons behind. The Roman soldiers, seeing this, only pressed their attack harder. They showed no mercy. For them, this was not just a battle. It was revenge for the burned cities, for their murdered comrades, for the mutilated women and children in Camulodunum and Londinium. The cavalry closed the ring, and the slaughter became total. Legionaries stabbed and hacked at everyone, advancing over the bodies of the fallen. The psychological effect of this trap was colossal. The Britons found themselves in a situation with no hope of escape. They could neither fight nor flee. They could only die, locked in a cage they had built from their own overconfidence. It was the apex of the tragedy, a grim finale that demonstrated how pride and a lack of strategic thinking can lead to complete and utter self-destruction. What followed the breaking of the Briton lines, Tacitus describes with a single word: slaughter, cades. The Roman soldiers, their fury fueled by memories of the atrocities committed by the rebels, took no prisoners. This was not just a military necessity. It was an act of vengeance. They killed everyone who crossed their path, making no distinction between warriors, women, and children. According to Tacitus, even the baggage animals were slaughtered and added to the heaps of corpses. This boundless cruelty was a response to Boudica's cruelty. The war had crossed a line beyond which no rules or concepts of honor remained. This was a war of total annihilation. The psychology of the legionaries at that moment was simple and clear. They had seen the burned cities with their own eyes. They had heard the survivors' tales of ritual torture and execution. In their eyes, The Britons were not enemy soldiers, but wild beasts who had to be exterminated to secure their own lives and the future of the province. Suetonius Paulinus, cold-blooded and pragmatic, certainly did not stop the massacre. He understood that only a complete and final crushing of the revolt, only total terror in response to terror, could dissuade the local tribes from any desire to rebel for generations to come. He needed to teach a lesson that would be remembered, and that lesson was written in the blood of tens of thousands on the field at Watling Street. The lack of prisoners also explains why Boudica's army disappeared. It wasn't scattered or dispersed. The majority of it was physically annihilated in one place, in a matter of hours. This was not just a victory, it was an extermination, meant to tear the root of the rebellion from British soil forever. The casualty figures cited by Tacitus in his Annals are staggering and hold the key to understanding the scale of the catastrophe. By his account, nearly 80,000 Britons fell in this battle. The Romans lost only about 400 men, with a similar number wounded. Even if we assume that Tacitus, as a Roman historian, might have exaggerated enemy losses and minimized his own, the order of magnitude is likely correct. How was such a monstrous loss ratio, roughly 200 to 1, even possible? The answer lies in the combination of all the factors described. First, the tactical genius of Suetonius in choosing a battlefield that nullified the Britons' numerical advantage. Second, the iron discipline, superior equipment, and honed tactics of the Roman legionaries, who turned the fight into a methodical slaughter. Third, the fatal mistake of the Britons themselves, blocking their own retreat with their baggage train, which turned defeat into total annihilation. Fourth, the Britons' lack of heavy armor and their reliance on long swords, useless in a tight melee. And finally, the Roman decision to take no prisoners and to kill everyone. The Battle of Watling Street became a textbook example of how a small, highly professional, and well-led army can completely destroy an enemy that is many times larger but poorly organized. The statistics of this disaster are not just numbers. They are a verdict on Boudica's entire war machine, which turned out to be a colossus with feet of clay, powerful but fragile, capable of great destruction, but utterly non-viable in a direct confrontation with a systemic and professional enemy. And so, we arrive at the final answer to the main question. How and why did a 100,000-strong army simply disappear? It disappeared because it was physically annihilated in one place, in one day. This was not a defeat after which an army retreats, regroups, and continues the fight. This was a complete and final collapse. Imagine the scene after the battle. On a small patch of land lie the bodies of 80,000 people, men, women, children. This is the flower of the nation, the gene pool of the two largest tribes in eastern Britain, the Iceni and the Trinovantes. Their political and military elite was wiped out. Their warriors were massacred. The few who managed to escape the meat grinder were scattered, demoralized, and leaderless. They fled into the forests and swamps, but what awaited them was not freedom, but a different, slower death. In the land they themselves had ravaged, a terrible famine began. The fields had not been planted. The supplies had been eaten or destroyed. The surviving participants of the rebellion were doomed to starve or be enslaved. The Romans, in turn, began punitive operations, scouring the countryside and destroying any remaining pockets of resistance. Boudica's army disappeared because it had never been an army in the Roman sense of the word. It was a people on the march, and when it was broken, it ceased to exist as a coherent whole. It had no rear bases, no contingency plans, no system of mobilization. Its strength was in its unity and numbers, and as soon as that unity was shattered and its numbers were thinned, the entire structure instantly crumbled to dust. The disappearance was not mystical, but brutally materialistic. It was a combination of total military defeat, the subsequent massacre, famine, and punitive actions that wiped not only the army, but the very social base of the rebellion off the face of the earth. The resolution to this historical paradox lies in an ironic finale. Britain was saved for Rome, not so much by the valor of its soldiers, as by the perfection of its system. Yes, the legionaries showed incredible courage and resilience, and Suetonius Paulinus demonstrated tactical genius. But ultimately, Boudica was defeated not by an army, but by Roman civilization itself. Her rebellion was a clash of two fundamentally different worlds. Boudica's world was based on the personal charisma of a leader, on emotions, fury, revenge, on tribal loyalty, and on a concept of war as a total, but short-term impulse. Rome's world was based on an impersonal system, on logistics, on engineering, on bureaucracy, on law, even if cruel, and on a concept of war as a science, a profession. Boudica's army was powerful but fragile, like a bolt of lightning. The Roman war machine was slow but indestructible, like the advance of a glacier. The irony is that all the qualities that made the Britons so terrifying at the start of the rebellion, their fury, their contempt for death, their unity and hatred, are what ultimately led them to their doom. They were too blinded by emotion to think strategically. They were too confident in their strength to notice the trap. They were too focused on destruction to think about creation. Rome, on the other hand, by sacrificing cities and thousands of lives, preserved the one thing that mattered: the system, the army that was its backbone. And once that system had the chance to strike back, it did so with cold, mathematical precision, annihilating its emotional and chaotic opponent. Suetonius's victory was the triumph of order over chaos, of calculation over fury, of the system over the storm. Boudica's own fate after the catastrophe at Watling Street is shrouded in mystery, which only added to her legend. Roman historians offer two main versions of her end. Tacitus, the most reliable source, reports that Boudica, seeing the total destruction of her army and unwilling to be captured, only to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome during Suetonius's triumph, committed suicide by taking poison. This version fits the image of a proud and indomitable queen, for whom death was preferable to dishonor. Cassius Dio, writing later, offers a different version. He states that after the defeat, Boudica fell ill and died, and the Britons gave her a lavish funeral. Regardless of which version is true, the outcome was the same. With her death, the rebellion definitively lost its heart and its symbol. Organized resistance ceased. Boudica's body was never found. Her grave, if it ever existed, remains one of Britain's greatest archaeological mysteries. This disappearance of her physical remains played a key role in her later mythologizing. She did not remain in history as a captured and humiliated queen. She departed, her spirit undefeated, dissolving into the mists and legends of her homeland. Her exit was the final act of the drama, completing her journey from an insulted widow to the fiery scourge of the Romans, and finally, to a phantom symbol of freedom. With her death, the bloodiest chapter in the history of Roman Britain came to an end, and a long, cold silence of the imperial peace fell upon the ravaged land. Boudica's legacy is perhaps the most striking paradox in her entire story. To the Romans, her contemporaries, she was nothing more than a virago, a man-like woman, a savage and bloodthirsty barbarian who led a senseless and brutal revolt. For many centuries, her name was synonymous with terror and barbarism. After the rebellion was crushed, she was effectively erased from history, and throughout the Middle Ages, she was almost entirely forgotten. Her triumphant return occurred only during the Renaissance, when the works of Tacitus were rediscovered. But she became a true icon much later, in the 19th century, during the reign of another powerful queen, Victoria. Victorian England, at the peak of its imperial power, was searching its history for national heroes, symbols of the British spirit. And it found one in Boudica. An incredible transformation took place. The Celtic queen, who had fiercely fought against foreign invaders and imperial expansion, was turned into a symbol of the British Empire itself. She became the personification of British liberty, resilience, and defiance. Poets like Alfred Tennyson celebrated her in their verses, and in 1902, a grandiose statue of her was erected in the very heart of London, on the Thames Embankment, next to the Houses of Parliament. Boudica, with her daughters, in her war chariot. In this way, the woman who had burned Roman London to the ground became its bronze defender. This historical oxymoron perfectly illustrates how history and myth can intertwine, and how each era rewrites the past to fit its own needs and ideology. And so, we return to the central paradox to give a final, synthetic answer. Boudica's 100,000-strong, fiery whirlwind was doomed from the start, because it was just that, a whirlwind. It was a natural phenomenon, not a stable structure. Its power lay in its speed, fury, and mass, but it lacked the key elements necessary for a long-term war against a superpower like Rome. First, the rebellion had no clear political goal beyond the expulsion of the Romans. What came next? The creation of a unified Celtic state? A return to tribal anarchy? No one thought about it. It was a war of revenge, not a war of policy. Second, as we've seen, the army had no logistics. It was a giant parasitic organism that could only exist by consuming the enemy's resources. Once those resources ran out, it was doomed to starvation. Third, Boudica had no long-term strategy. She won battles but lost the war, wasting time on the symbolic destruction of cities instead of pursuing and destroying the only real threat, Suetonius's army. And finally, her power was emotional, not institutional. It was held together by her personal charisma and a collective surge of hatred. Such a force cannot withstand the first serious defeat. When the army was crushed and the leader was dead, the rebellion had nothing left. No institutions, no ideology, beyond revenge, no resources to rise again. It flared up like a dry haystack and burned out just as quickly. The Roman system, by contrast, was built to withstand terrible blows. Rome lost entire legions and even armies, as in the Teutoburg Forest, but the empire itself remained, because its strength was not in individuals, but in institutions, laws, and organization. Boudica's army was an event, the Roman Empire was a process, and in the long run of history, the process almost always defeats the event. Boudica's story, stripped of myths and imperial propaganda, leaves us with a profound and universal philosophical lesson about the eternal clash of two fundamental forces of human civilization: fury and order. Fury, born of humiliation and injustice, is capable of working miracles. It can unite scattered tribes, inspire hundreds of thousands to self-sacrifice, and wipe seemingly indestructible citadels from the face of the earth. Fury is the great engine of change, the primal energy that prevents the world from freezing into tyranny and stagnation. Boudica's rebellion is a hymn to this sacred fury, a hymn to the human spirit that refuses to be enslaved. But this same story also shows us the dark side of fury, its limits, and its curse. Fury is blind. It is incapable of creating. It can only destroy. It cannot tolerate discipline or calculation. It lives only for the moment. It can burn London, but it cannot build an aqueduct. Order, in turn, represented by Rome, is the force that builds empires. It is based on logic, discipline, systems, and ruthless efficiency. It can be cruel, soulless, and unjust, but it is what creates roads, laws, cities, and the stability that allows civilization to develop. Boudica's path is the tragedy of the idealist who challenges an indestructible machine. Her story reminds us that righteous anger alone is not enough to win. To change the world, fury must be armed with reason, and the impulse for freedom must be backed by strategy and organization. Otherwise, even the brightest fire of resistance is doomed to burn out, leaving behind only cold ashes and the eternal question: what is the price of freedom, and what is truly stronger, the flame of human passion or the icy march of history?